He's going to kill that boy if someone doesn't stop him. The words tore out of Clara Pierce before she could stop them, before her mind could calculate the cost of speaking them aloud. Summer rain hammered the Los Angeles warehouse district like bullets on a tin roof, lightning cracking the purple sky open, turning the August heat into cold sheets of water that soaked through her second-hand jacket in seconds. She stood between 3 armed men and a bleeding child, her body trembling but her feet planted solid on wet asphalt. The men wore expensive suits now dark with rain, water streaming off shoulders broad enough to block out the streetlight, guns visible under their jackets like promises of violence. The child, maybe 8 years old, dark curly hair plastered to his forehead, clutched his side where blood mixed with rainwater, his eyes wide and animal and terrified. Clara had been walking back from St. Mary's Hospital where her daughter Micah lay recovering in room 317, taking the shortcut through the warehouse district because the bus fare cost $3 and she had exactly $200 to her name until the next impossible day arrived. That was when she heard the boy scream. A sound like something being torn apart. The largest man stepped forward, his shoes precise on the wet ground. "Walk away, lady. This does not concern you." His voice came out like gravel. Like a threat wrapped in casual dismissal. But Clara saw the boy's face. She saw him looking at her the way Micah looked at her every night before the surgery they could never afford, the way children look at adults when they believe someone will save them. Her hand shot out. She gripped the boy's shoulder, small and sharp under her palm, and positioned her body between the child and the guns. "You will not touch him." Not a request. Something in her voice made the man pause. In the distance, a car horn blared 3 times, quick and urgent. Behind a black SUV parked 30 feet away in the warehouse shadows, Dante Conti stood motionless in the rain. Water streamed down the window he watched through, and the phone frozen halfway to his ear suddenly felt heavy in his hand. His nephew. His sister's only son. The boy who had shown up at the docks 3 hours ago with a message from the Castellano family about territory and payment, a message delivered to a child so that Dante would understand the threat was intimate, was personal, was designed to reach through his chest and stop his heart. And this woman, this stranger in a soaked Goodwill jacket with holes worn through the heels of her shoes, had just positioned herself between Marco and 3 of his enforcers like she weighed 300 pounds instead of maybe 110. Dante lowered the phone. Marco, the largest enforcer, did not move. Neither did Sergio on his left or the younger man on his right whose name Dante could not remember because he had only hired him last week. They stood there in the rain, weapons in hand, facing a woman whose courage made no sense in a world where sense kept you alive. "Last chance," Marco said. His voice had changed. Something uncertain had crept into it. Clara did not move. She did not speak. She just stood there with her hand on the boy's shoulder, her jaw set like she was carved from stone herself, and waited to see if men with guns would really kill a woman in broad daylight on a Los Angeles street. The rain fell. The sky cracked again with lightning. At exactly that moment, Dante moved. His footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. The enforcer turned, all 3 of them turned, and when they saw who emerged from the darkness, something cold and dangerous shifted in the air. Dante Conti was tall, perhaps 6'2", with shoulders that looked like they had been built to carry empires. His hair was dark, combed back from a face that might have been handsome once before it became the kind of face that made people instinctively step backward. He wore a cashmere coat the color of charcoal, open despite the rain, revealing an expensive white shirt and the faintest glimpse of scars running down his chest like a map of violence. His eyes were storm gray and utterly still. A scar ran from the outside of his left eye to the corner of his mouth, old, pale, dignified in the way scars become when worn by powerful men. His watch caught the lightning. Gold. Real gold. "Step back," he said. His voice came out deep and solid like an oath, like a command that had never in its history been disobeyed. Marco stepped back. Sergio and the 3rd man moved like puppets with their strings cut, creating space, creating air, creating distance. The boy made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a breath. Clara knelt down, still trembling, and pulled him toward her. His blood soaked into her jacket, but she did not notice. She did not notice anything except that he was still breathing, still conscious, still alive. Behind the warehouse, a siren began to wail in the distance. But what she did not know, what Clara Pierce could not have understood standing on the wet asphalt with a bleeding child in her arms, was that the man now watching her with an expression she could not read controlled every street in this city. That his reach extended into the police department, the hospitals, the courts, every institution built to protect or destroy. That her courage in this exact moment, this small and reckless act of defiance, would trigger a chain of events that would expose every person who had spent months systematically destroying her. That this man, standing in the rain with his expensive coat and his storm-grey eyes, had been looking for a reason to burn down the people who had hurt her. And now he had found one. Now, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you do not miss what is coming tomorrow. Because what happens next will change everything. Now let us go back to 10 days earlier, to the moment before the warehouse, before the rain, before Clara Pierce became visible to the kind of man who could make the powerful disappear. Let us return to the beginning, when she still believed that hard work and kindness could save her daughter's life. Let us return to the Ashford mansion and the converted closet where she had been living and dying slowly, $1 at a time. The clock on the nightstand read 5:16 in the morning. Clara Pierce was already awake. She had been awake since 4:30, counting the bills spread across the small table that served as both her dresser and her bedroom in what had once been a maid's closet on the 3rd floor of the Ashford mansion. $173.42. That was everything she had. That number had to last until her next paycheck in 9 days, and the next paycheck would go to the hospital, and the next one, and the next one, disappearing into the machinery of modern medicine like water into sand. The closet measured 8 feet by 6 feet. There was no window. The walls were painted an institutional beige that had faded to the color of old teeth. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling. This was where she slept, where she kept her 2 uniforms, both black, both borrowed originally from other nannies, and where at 5:24 in the morning she counted her money and tried not to calculate how many days of this remained ahead of her. She did not eat breakfast. Eating breakfast was a luxury she had removed from her life 3 months ago, the way you remove a tooth, decisively, completely, and with permanent loss. Instead, she showered in the bathroom shared with the house staff, changed into her first uniform, and climbed the narrow stairs to the Ashford mansion's main floor where she would see Micah for the first time that day. The kitchen was empty except for Elena, the cook, who was Spanish and kind in the way that people are kind when they have known suffering themselves. Elena had left out 3 scrambled eggs and a piece of toast on a plate labeled Clara and did not look up when Clara walked past her to clear it away. Some kindnesses could not be acknowledged without breaking. They had learned this. Micah was waiting on the 2nd floor landing in her pink pajamas, her small frame swimming in cloth that hung loose on her increasingly fragile body. At 7 years old, she weighed 41 pounds. The cardiologist had said 43 at her last appointment, which counted as progress, as victory, as one more day closer to the surgery that would cost more money than Clara would earn in 5 years of work. Micah's hair was the color of honey. Her eyes were the precise color of her mother's eyes, a soft brown that made people instinctively soften around her. "Mama, my chest hurts again," Micah said. She said this every morning now. The doctors had explained that the pain in her chest was psychological, that the defective valve in her heart was not causing pain but rather her anxiety about the valve was manifesting as pain, which was a clinical way of saying that her child's terror had become corporeal, had become something she could point to and name. Clara knelt down. She did not say, "It will be fine," because she had learned that lies, even kind ones, were poison to children. Instead, she pulled Micah toward her and felt the small heartbeat skip and flutter against her own ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. "I know, sweetheart. The doctors are going to fix it. We're going to make it better." When? That was the question. The surgery was scheduled for October 15th. It was August 1st, 75 days away. And the cost was $200,000. $200,000. The number existed in Clara's mind like a mountain that could never be climbed, like a distance that could never be crossed, like a wall built from absolute impossible mathematics. She had been a live-in nanny for the Ashford family for 2 years. Her salary was $32,000 per year. After taxes, after rent paid to Victoria Ashford, the mansion's owner, a woman who wore her cruelty like perfume, she made approximately $1,200 per month. $1,200. To earn $200,000, she would need to work without sleeping for more than 21 years straight. But Micah did not need her money. Micah needed a miracle. And Clara had not heard about any miracles that could be paid for in $1,200 increments. The intercom on the landing crackled to life. Victoria Ashford's voice descended from invisible speakers like a judgment. "Clara! My daughter will not eat her breakfast. Manage this." "Yes, Mrs. Ashford." The intercom died. Micah looked up at her mother with eyes that had learned too young how to be afraid, and Clara made a decision that would change everything. She made a decision to walk through the warehouse district when she should have paid the $3 for the bus. She made a decision to hear a child scream and not walk away. She made a decision to stand between armed men and a bleeding boy who was not her own. But she did not know that yet. Right now, she only knew that Micah needed her, that the morning was beginning, that Victoria Ashford was waiting, and that somewhere in the mathematics of desperation and time, she had to find a way to survive. It was 5:16 a.m. when Clara Pierce's alarm screamed into the darkness of her converted closet, the phone's cracked screen casting a sickly blue glow across 7 feet of space that she had learned to call home. She silenced it before the second beep. The Ashford household woke to no noise but the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of the city breathing outside the mansion's walls. Clara pulled on her grey nanny uniform, the fabric worn soft from washing, and twisted her dark hair back with the same rubber band she'd been using for 6 months because she could not afford a new one. Every dollar mattered now. Every single dollar. The mirror above her sink was the size of a postcard. She did not look at herself anymore. She only looked at the clock. 6:02 a.m. 13 minutes to reach the kitchen before Victoria Ashford's expectations became disappointed silence, and disappointed silence in this house carried consequences that felt like weight. The stairs descended through cold marble hallways lined with paintings that cost more than Clara's entire annual salary. $32,000 per year. That number had once felt like abundance when she was working the graveyard shift at a diner, eating scraps, living in her car with a newborn. Now it felt like poverty disguised as employment. She descended into the kitchen at 6:14 a.m., 1 minute early, and began preparing breakfast for the Ashford twins as the first light touched the windows overlooking the service entrance. Emily and Charlotte arrived at 7:20 a.m. in matching pajamas, their feet bare on heated tile, their eyes still soft with sleep. These children had never counted dollars. They did not understand that their piano lessons cost more per month than Clara's daughter's life. At least, that was what the doctors had explained it as. Not in those exact words. The doctor's words had been clinical, mathematical, impossible. "Good morning, sweethearts," Clara said, and her voice did not shake. She had learned to control her voice. She had learned to control everything except the trembling in her hands, which she hid by keeping them busy with eggs, with toast, with the small rituals of feeding children who belonged to someone else while her own daughter lay in a hospital bed 40 miles away. "Clara, will you braid my hair?" Charlotte asked, her mouth full of scrambled egg. "After breakfast. We have ballet at 2:15 today, remember?" The child nodded, satisfied. She did not know that every moment Clara spent braiding her hair was a moment Clara could have been working a second job. She did not know that her mother had demanded Clara work an additional 2 hours per day without additional pay to maintain professional standards of attentiveness. She could not know. She was 7 years old and existed in a universe where needs were met and safety was assumed. Victoria Ashford entered the kitchen at 7:31 a.m., 1 minute later than expected, which meant something had already displeased her. She wore a cream silk robe that caught the light like water, and her platinum hair was styled with the precision of someone whose appearance was a weapon. Her eyes moved across the kitchen, searching for failure. She found it everywhere. "The eggs are slightly brown at the edges," Victoria observed, not as a comment but as an indictment. "They should be pale yellow." "Scrambled eggs are not difficult, Clara. My college-aged niece manages them without charring the edges." Clara set down her spatula. "Yes, Mrs. Ashford. I apologize. I'll prepare them again." "No. The children will eat them. But next time, you'll remember." Victoria poured herself coffee from the carafe Clara had prepared at 5:52 a.m. The coffee was still hot. Victoria took one sip, set it down without drinking more, and turned her attention to the twins. "Emily, Charlotte, finish quickly. We're leaving for the country club in 30 minutes, and I won't have you arriving late and disheveled." After Victoria left, Emily looked up at Clara. Her small face was serious in a way that children's faces should never be serious. "Clara, why do you always look sad?" The question arrived like a blade. Clara knelt beside the child's chair, and something in her chest cracked open, a fissure that had been forming for months, for years, for the entire duration of this impossible mathematics she was living inside. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," Clara said, and the lie tasted like copper. "I'm just thinking about someone I love very much." Emily reached up and touched Clara's cheek. The gesture was so gentle, so purely compassionate, that Clara had to close her eyes. When she opened them, Emily had already returned to her eggs. That afternoon, while the twins were at ballet and Victoria was at the country club for her membership renewal, Clara sat on her narrow cot in her converted closet and counted her money. The ritual took exactly 6 minutes. $200. That was everything. That was her entire financial existence distilled to 8 bills, 3 fives, and a handful of coins. $200. In 10 days, the hospital would require a payment, a substantial one, or Micah would be moved to palliative care only. No surgery. No chance. She pulled the drawing from her apron pocket, the one Emily had made 3 days ago. A crude sketch in crayon, stick figures holding hands. Clara, Emily, Charlotte, labeled beneath each figure in block letters. A house with a sun in the corner. A family that did not belong to her but that she belonged to, somehow, in the small spaces between her employment and her survival. There was a knock on her closet door at exactly 7:15 p.m. Clara knew this time precisely because she checked her phone before opening it. Robert Hargrove stood in the narrow hallway outside her room, a man in his early 60s with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to obedience. He owned the converted closet. More accurately, he owned the mansion, and he owned Clara's access to shelter, and in Los Angeles in August, shelter was the difference between survival and collapse. "May I come in?" he asked, though he was already entering, already closing the door behind him in a space so small that the two of them could almost touch. "Of course, Mr. Hargrove," Clara said, standing. She had learned the required posture, straight-backed, eyes down but not frightened, the exact calibration of submission that did not invite cruelty. "I've been reviewing your contract," he said. He held a sheaf of papers, the ones Clara had signed 2 years ago when she was desperate for any roof, any shelter, any way to stabilize her daughter. "It specifies that rent is due on the 1st of each month. $500. "Yes, sir. I have that scheduled for. You have 3 days late. Twice this year. Once in March, once in June." Clara's stomach compressed into a fist. She could not afford to lose this space. The girls depended on her. Micah depended on her. Everything depended on this narrow closet and the $1,800 that arrived every 15 days. "I apologize," Clara said. "The hospital billing cycles." "I don't need to hear about your daughter," Robert said flatly. "What I need is for you to understand that my patience is not infinite. The rent increases to $600 effective immediately. The 1-month notice is hereby served. You have 30 days to secure alternative housing, or you will be removed from the premises." The words arrived one at a time, each one a small injury. 600. 30 days. Alternative housing. In Los Angeles, in her price range, alternative housing did not exist. This was why she lived in a closet. This was why she had nowhere else to go. Mr. Hargrove, He was already opening the door. I expect the first payment at $600 on the 1st of next month. Thank you, Clara. When he left, the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It was the sound of mathematics becoming impossible. It was the sound of 30 days becoming 28, becoming 20, becoming a countdown that had no positive outcome, only variations of disaster. At 11:56 p.m., Clara sat on her cot with her phone in her trembling hands. The hospital billing department did not answer. Of course they did not answer. It was nearly midnight. But she scrolled through the numbers anyway, through the itemizations, through the impossibilities, because at least when she was looking at the numbers, she was not thinking about where she would sleep in 30 days. She was not thinking about what happened to 5-year-old girls whose mothers could not afford to keep a roof over their heads and a surgery paid for at the same time. She did not know that at that exact moment, Dante Conti was driving through the warehouse district 7 miles away, his black SUV moving soundlessly through the humid August night. She did not know that tomorrow would bring a decision that would push her toward the warehouse, toward a moment that existed like a blade waiting to be drawn, waiting for the exact angle of light that would make it visible. All she knew was that she had 10 days. 10 days until Micah's surgery deadline. 10 days until Robert Hargrove's new rent became due. 10 days that somehow had to contain 21 years' worth of impossible earnings, and she had no idea how to make the mathematics bend toward survival. She folded the drawing from Emily and placed it back inside her apron pocket. She set her alarm for 5:02 a.m. She closed her eyes and did not sleep, because sleep felt like a luxury, and every moment she was awake was a moment she could be searching, calculating, finding the answer that the universe had not yet revealed. What changed everything was not a decision she made. What changed everything was a sound, the distant wail of sirens moving through the Los Angeles night, heading toward the warehouse district, heading toward a moment that would crack her small, contained world wide open. The operating room doors slid shut at 9:58 in the morning, and Clara sat alone in the waiting area with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned white. Micah's drawing, the one with the blue house and the 3 stick figures holding hands, lay on her lap, folded into creases from being carried in her apron pocket for months. The paper was soft from touch, the crayon colors fading where Clara's thumb had worn the surface thin. She had not slept. She had not eaten. She had only sat in the hospital corridor from 5 in the morning, watching the surgical staff move in and out of pre-op, watching her daughter in her hospital gown looking so small, so brave, asking only, "Will you be here when I wake up, Mama?" "Yes, baby. I will be right here." 2 hours passed. Then 3. The clock on the wall read 1:23 when Dr. Moretti appeared, still in her surgical mask, and Clara's heart stopped because she could not read the woman's face, could not tell if the next words would be the ones that saved her or destroyed her. "She made it through beautifully," Dr. Moretti said, and Clara's entire body went slack with relief. The valve replacement was textbook perfect. "She's in recovery now. You can see her in about 30 minutes." Clara wept. She wept in a way she had not permitted herself to weep in years, hunched forward with her daughter's drawing pressed to her chest, while nurses moved around her with quiet compassion. One of them, a woman named Susan with graying hair and kind eyes, placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Your daughter is a fighter. She's going to be fine." Micah was fine. Micah was going to live. While Clara sat in that recovery room watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with lungs that were finally getting proper blood flow, Dante Conti was in his penthouse office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Los Angeles, making phone calls that would systematically dismantle Robert Hargrove's world. He had looked up the man's name in 15 minutes. The rest took planning. "Sergio," Dante said into his phone, "I want financials on Robert Hargrove. Everything. Bank accounts, property deeds, loans. I want to know every penny he's ever stolen." "Sergio, who had worked for Dante for 17 years, did not ask why. He simply said, "Done by morning." The second call went to a federal agent Dante had leverage over, old favors, old secrets. "There's a man named Robert Hargrove, property management, operates in the Mid-City district. I want to know if he's breaking any laws. Extortion, sexual coercion, landlord violations. Look closely." The agent, who owed Dante his career and possibly his freedom, said, "Give me 2 days." The third call was to a journalist Dante occasionally fed stories to, a woman who ran a column on housing discrimination and tenant abuse in Los Angeles. "There's a story for you. A landlord, Robert Hargrove, who preys on vulnerable tenants. Single mothers, immigrants, people who can't fight back. He extorts them, threatens them, uses their desperation as leverage." The journalist's voice sharpened. "Can you get me documentation?" "I'll have it by tonight," Dante said. By 6 p.m., the federal agent called back. Robert Hargrove had 14 open complaints filed against him. 14. Extortion from 4 women. Sexual coercion from 2. Rent increases that violated city ordinance. Bogus eviction notices. The man was a predator operating in plain sight because his victims had been afraid, isolated, without resources. At 8 p.m., the journalist had names, dates, and financial records showing where Hargrove's illegal gains had gone. A second property. A boat. A mistress he kept in an apartment he'd extorted from a widow. By midnight, the journalist's story went live online. Landlord preys on vulnerable tenants, how one man's extortion scheme operated for years undetected. The piece included photographs. Hargrove's face. His property management company. Every name of every woman he'd coerced. And by dawn, the story had been picked up by 3 local news stations, then by national outlets. By noon, Robert Hargrove's phone was ringing with calls from federal investigators, journalists, and angry women who suddenly felt brave enough to speak. His bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. His properties were being audited. His mistress had called his wife. He would be arrested by Friday. But that morning, as Clara sat beside Micah's hospital bed watching her daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in months, she had no idea that the man who had saved her daughter's life had also just orchestrated the destruction of her landlord. She knew only that Micah was alive, that the surgery had worked, that they had a future. What she did not know was that Victoria Ashford had been watching. Watching Clara leave with Dante Conti. Watching the story break about Robert Hargrove. Watching the connections in her mind form a picture she could not quite see clearly. And Victoria Ashford, who had spent 40 years building a reputation as the most gracious hostess in Los Angeles society, was not a woman who tolerated mysteries or threats to her carefully constructed world. Victoria called Clara into the main sitting room on the morning of Micah's discharge. The room was all marble and crystal, all carefully curated perfection. Victoria herself sat in a velvet chair in a Chanel suit, her grey hair arranged in waves that cost $400 to maintain. She looked at Clara the way one looks at a stain on expensive fabric. "I understand your daughter is well," Victoria began, her voice smooth as poison. "How fortunate for you." "Yes, Mrs. Ashford. The surgery went beautifully. We're very grateful." "Grateful?" Victoria smiled. "To whom, Clara? Your salary here barely covers rent. Where did you find $200,000 for a pediatric valve replacement?" Clara's mouth went dry. "The hospital has payment plans. The hospital said the account was covered by a private sponsor. They wouldn't tell me who." Victoria stood and walked closer, her heels clicking against marble. "So here's what I'm wondering. How did a nanny in a converted closet suddenly acquire a wealthy benefactor? And why was that benefactor driving a car that costs more than my annual household budget?" "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Victoria circled her like a predator. "I mean that you've clearly been lying about your circumstances. Clearly you have connections I don't know about. Clearly you've been using your position here, in my home, with my children, to make connections for your own benefit. That's not what happened. What happened, Victoria interrupted, her voice turning sharp as a knife, is that I'm questioning your reliability. I'm questioning your integrity. And I'm wondering if perhaps you should look for employment elsewhere. Somewhere less respectable. Somewhere that matches your actual character. The words landed like physical blows. Mrs. Ashford, I would never. You're fired, Clara. Pack your things. You have until 6 p.m. to vacate the apartment. I'll have a check cut for your final week, and we'll call it even. I'll also make sure to mention to my friends in the community that you've become unreliable. Untrustworthy. I wouldn't want them to make the same mistake I did in hiring you. Clara stood in that marble room, in her maid's uniform, while the woman who had employed her for 2 years systematically destroyed her reputation. Victoria had connections throughout Los Angeles society. If Victoria said Clara was untrustworthy, no respectable family would hire her. Clara had been living on the edge of survival, and Victoria had just pushed her over it. She had nowhere to live. She was about to be unemployed. Micah was getting out of the hospital tomorrow and would need care, medication, follow-ups with specialists. That evening, Clara called Dante's number. The voice that answered was not Dante but a man, Sergio, who listened carefully and said only, "Stay on the line." Dante picked up a minute later. His voice was different when he heard her situation, colder and sharper, like a blade being drawn. "Where are you now?" "At the mansion. I have until 6 p.m. to get Micah. Get everything you own. I'm sending a car. 30 minutes. I can't, you've already done so much." "Yes, you can. And I haven't done nearly enough." His voice carried something dangerous, something that made clear that Victoria Ashford had just made a very serious mistake. "Get in that car, Clara. Let me take care of this." Rain hammered against the federal courthouse steps like 1,000 accusations. Robert Hargrove stood in his orange jumpsuit, hands shackled, his face the color of old meat, trembling like a wounded animal as agents led him toward the transport vehicle. The cameras flashed so bright it looked like lightning. His mouth opened and closed, words dying before they reached air. 23 years of predatory confidence had evaporated in a single morning, leaving behind only a terrified man who'd finally understood that some debts demand payment. 3 blocks away, in a brownstone with sunlight streaming through clean windows, Clara Pierce sat on a bed that was hers, truly hers, not rented, not borrowed, not held over her head like a blade, and watched the news footage with her daughter sleeping against her shoulder. Micah's breathing was steady now. The new heart valve the surgeons had installed was beating in perfect rhythm, each pump a second chance Clara had almost traded away for Robert Hargrove's cruelty. But what happened in those 72 hours between the moment Clara sent that text message to Dante Conti and the moment federal agents led Robert out in handcuffs was something most people would never believe. That Tuesday morning, before dawn touched the sky, before Robert finished his first cup of coffee, before he'd even had time to feel confident about Clara's surrender, the knock came. Not polite. Not negotiable. The kind of knock that wakes neighbors and echoes through apartment buildings like thunder. Federal agents had warrants for everything. Financial records. Property deeds. Communications with drug traffickers Robert had helped launder money for 15 years prior. The case had been building for months, Dante's people had been digging, collecting, documenting, but they'd waited. They'd waited until Clara was safe. Until she was settled in the brownstone with Micah recovering at St. Mary's Hospital, 3 blocks away, her tiny frame curled under white blankets in room 317. "Robert Hargrove, you're under arrest for money laundering, wire fraud, housing code violations, and predatory lending practices spanning 15 years. The agent read him his rights while Robert's face cycled through shock, disbelief, then catastrophic understanding. By the time they pushed his head down into the federal vehicle, by the time the news cameras caught every angle of his humiliation, he was crying. His bathrobe hung open. His hands shook so violently the cuffs rattled against his wrists. The prosecutor's case was ironclad. 47 counts. No plea bargains. The jury took 90 minutes. Guilty. Every single charge. 40 years in federal prison, the judge said, her voice like ice water. No possibility of parole before 20 years served. Robert collapsed in the defendant's chair. He'd preyed on women like Clara for his entire career, believing the world operated on a simple principle: the powerful consume the weak, and weakness was the only currency that mattered. He'd never imagined a world where someone would fight back. Where an invisible woman in a maid's uniform would matter enough for a man like Dante Conti to burn his entire operation hunting for evidence. But while Robert's arrest made headlines that night, Victoria Ashford's would eclipse it completely. Federal agents hit the Ashford mansion at 6 in the morning. Victoria was still in her silk robe, her platinum hair still perfect, her face still arranged in the expression of someone who believed rules applied to other people. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice steady, her hand reaching for her phone. "I have lawyers. I have friends. Your friends can't help you now, Mrs. Ashford." The agent placed documentation on her marble table, the same marble table where she'd humiliated Clara in front of 6 society women. $8 million in embezzled charity funds. Money that should have gone to children's hospitals. Money that should have funded cancer research, funded education programs, funded the kind of help that existed for people like Clara if people like Victoria hadn't stolen it. Tax evasion. Wire fraud. Embezzlement. The handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists while her twins watched from the staircase, crying. The security cameras she'd installed to spy on her servants recorded every second of her arrest. The perp walk was broadcast live on 3 news channels. Her mugshot went viral, mouth twisted in rage, eyes bulging, expensive face cream smeared with tears and mascara. 35 years. No parole before 18. The empire of cruelty collapsed in a single morning. The phone that had called immigration services on Clara now recorded messages from lawyers. The friends who'd laughed at Clara's humiliation now answered Victoria's calls by rejecting them. The clubs that had welcomed her revoked membership in emails marked effective immediately. Within 48 hours, Victoria Ashford had transformed from a woman of consequence into a cautionary tale. By the time she reached federal prison in West Virginia, every inmate already knew what she'd done. The cruelty had a name now. The destruction had a face. That evening, Dante called Clara while she sat in the Brownstones' living room, the news playing on mute, Micah asleep in the next room. "Have you seen?" His voice came through steady, controlled, but underneath was something else. Something that sounded almost like gentleness. "Yes." "Are you okay?" Clara thought about the question. She'd spent 30 years surviving on her own strength, refusing to be saved, treating weakness like a contagion to be avoided. But somewhere in the last 10 days, something had shifted. She'd learned that strength wasn't about refusing help. It was about knowing who to trust with your breaking places. "I'm getting there," she said finally. Dante was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his words were careful, chosen. "Micah can come home tomorrow. The hospital called to confirm discharge paperwork. I've arranged for a home health nurse to visit twice a week during her recovery. And I've also arranged something else." "What?" "A job offer. A real one, not a favor. A foundation I'm establishing, the Pierce Foundation, for vulnerable families. For women in transition. You'd oversee operations. Full salary. Benefits. A chance to build something that helps people like you were helped." Clara's throat tightened. She thought about that moment in the rain, when she'd almost texted Robert Hargrove. When she'd almost traded everything for the illusion of safety. When a stranger in an expensive suit had chosen to fight for her instead. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you saved someone I love," Dante said. "Because you stood in the rain protecting a child you'd never met. Because the world needs more people like you, and it needs you alive and whole and able to do that work. That's why." 36 hours later, Clara brought Micah home from St. Mary's Hospital. Her daughter was small in the hospital wheelchair, pale from surgery, but her eyes were bright. The new heart valve beat steady in her chest, a mechanical rhythm that would keep her alive, keep her growing, give her the future that had seemed impossible when Clara couldn't find $200,000. The brownstone was waiting. Clean sheets on the beds. Food in the refrigerator. A home that was hers not because she'd sacrificed pieces of herself to earn it, but because she'd had the courage to refuse the transaction. That night, Micah asked the question Clara had been dreading and waiting for in equal measure, "Mama, why does Dante help us? Is he your boyfriend?" Clara sat on the edge of her daughter's bed, in the house that wasn't her house, understanding finally that some gifts couldn't be repaid with gratitude alone. "He's someone who believes in being kind when it would be easier to be cruel," Clara said. "Someone who understands that power is only real if you use it to protect people who can't protect themselves." Micah was quiet for a moment. "Then, I like him. Can we keep him?" Clara smiled, a real smile, not the exhausted performance she'd perfected over 30 years of survival. "We'll see," she said. "We'll see." Outside the window, the Los Angeles sky had finally cleared. The summer rain had moved east, leaving behind air so clean it tasted like possibility. And somewhere in that city, in an office tower overlooking the lights, Dante Conti sat with his lieutenant Sergio and watched the news footage of Robert Hargrove's arrest one more time. "She's going to be okay," Sergio said. It wasn't a question. "She was always going to be okay," Dante replied. She just needed someone to stop trying to convince her that survival meant selling herself. The silence between them was the silence of men who understood what had just shifted. Dante's reputation had always been built on vengeance, on the kind of power that destroyed. But for the first time in 15 years, it had been built on something else. Something that looked like protection. Something that looked almost like love. And in the brownstone 3 blocks away, Clara Pierce held her daughter's hand as Micah slipped into sleep, the rhythm of that new heart valve the sweetest sound Clara had ever heard. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara believed in miracles. 1 year after the warehouse where Clara Pierce stood between armed men and a bleeding child, she unlocked the door to her own brownstone in Los Angeles, held the key in her palm like proof that survival was possible. The walls belonged to her now. The silence belonged to her. The life she'd rebuilt piece by piece from nothing belonged to her alone, and she stood in the morning light filtering through windows she'd cleaned herself, breathing air that didn't taste like marble floors and cruelty. Micah was 8 blocks away at her first sleepover. At 6 years old, her daughter's heart valve, the one that cost $200,000, the number that had haunted Clara for 2 years, worked perfectly. No more hospital appointments. No more Claire's hand shaking as she counted pharmacy coparis. Just a small scar on her daughter's chest that Micah called her warrior mark, and the sound of her laughing as she packed her overnight bag for a normal childhood experience. Clara had been promoted to head librarian at the Los Angeles Central Library 3 weeks ago. The job came with health insurance, with retirement contributions, with a desk that faced east so she could watch the sunrise while she worked. She had $17,000 in a savings account. Not enough to feel safe forever, but enough to know that she would not be sleeping in her car. Enough to know she could feed her daughter without rationing. Enough to believe in tomorrow. The brownstone itself, 3 stories of brick and history in a neighborhood that was finally gentrifying instead of dying, had been transferred into her name by deed that morning. A birthday present from Dante Conti, who sat across from her every Thursday morning over coffee and conversation, who'd become as essential to her survival as breathing. What Clara didn't understand yet was why he did these things. Why a man whose name made other men pale with fear would spend his Thursday mornings listening to her recommend books. Why he'd memorized the names of Micah's doctors. Why he'd laughed so hard he'd cried when Micah explained that she was teaching Marco, Dante's nephew, the boy Clara had saved in the rain, how to braid hair. Dante arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening, standing at her door holding something wrapped in brown paper like a secret he couldn't keep anymore. The rain had started again, the kind of summer rain that turned the Los Angeles air heavy and alive, and water dripped from his black cashmere coat onto her threshold. He was 6'2", with shoulders that filled doorways, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes like storm clouds. A scar ran from his left eye to his cheekbone like the map of a war only he remembered. "What is this?" Clara asked, taking the package. Her heart was already accelerating. Dante never brought gifts. He said gifts created obligations, and he never wanted her to feel obligated. "Open it," he said simply. Inside was the drawing. The one that Micah had made 2 years ago when she was 4 years old and everything was collapsing around them. Clara's apron pocket had been full of it the night of the eviction, crayon stick figures, 3 of them with big smiling faces and their hands connected. A mommy and a baby and someone else, someone she'd drawn into existence like prayer. She'd lost it that night in the rain. She'd thought it was gone. The paper was yellowed now, the crayon worn thin in places. But it was intact. It was here. It was real. "How did you?" Clara whispered. "I had someone retrieve it from the mansion before Victoria's arrest," Dante said quietly. "I've been holding onto it for a year. Waiting for the right moment to give it back." Clara's hands trembled as she held the drawing. 1 year. He'd kept this for 1 year, this tiny artifact of a dream her 4-year-old daughter had drawn while sleeping in a converted closet, while Clara was terrified every single night that eviction would come before Micah's surgery, that the light in her daughter's eyes would extinguish because she couldn't provide. "Clara, I need to tell you something I should have said months ago," Dante said, and his voice dropped into a register she'd never heard before. Deep. Vulnerable. Like a man putting down armor. She looked up from the drawing. "The night you saved Marco," he continued, stepping inside and closing the door behind him so that rain and darkness stayed outside and only the 2 of them remained in this space that was now hers. "I watched you stand in the rain between armed men and a bleeding child you had never met. And I thought I was seeing the most courageous person alive." He moved closer, his movements careful, like approaching a wild thing that might bolt. "Then I got to know you. Really know you. And I realized courage was just the beginning. You rebuilt your entire life from cardboard boxes and nightmares. You turned pain into strength. You protected a stranger's child when it cost you the last safety you possessed." Tears were already running down Clara's face, but she didn't wipe them away. She held the drawing against her chest like it might protect her heart from what was coming. "I've spent 20 years building walls," he said. "Being feared instead of known. Being alone because alone meant no one could hurt me the way my father was hurt before I was old enough to stop it. But then you walked into the rain wearing a borrowed dress and a mother's desperation, and you tore those walls down without even trying." He reached out, tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek for 3 seconds that felt like hours. "I'm in love with you, Clara Pierce," he said simply. "I have been since the night you stood between my nephew and violence. But I waited to tell you because I needed you to be whole first. I needed you standing as my equal, not as someone I saved. Because you're not someone who needs saving. You're someone who saves others. You're someone who saves men stupid enough to think walls keep them safe." Clara couldn't speak. Her throat was closed, her entire body was trembling, and the drawing was the only thing keeping her anchored to the ground instead of floating away entirely. "What happens now?" she finally whispered. "Now we build something together," Dante said. "You, me, Micah, Marco. A family that isn't built on transactions or fear, but on the kind of courage you showed me in the rain. The kind that stands between violence and innocence. The kind that rebuilds from ashes and calls it a home." "I'm in love with you too," Clara said, and the words felt dangerous and true, like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. "I think I have been for months, but I was too scared to say it. Scared you were too good to be true. Scared that I'd wake up and you'd be gone, and Micah would cry, and I wouldn't survive losing you." "I'm not going anywhere," Dante said. "Unless you want me to." "Don't you dare," Clara said, and she kissed him, and it felt like coming home after a lifetime of walking in darkness, like the rain outside finally clearing away the last of the storm that had defined her survival. Through the window of the brownstone, Sergio and Enzo watched from the black SUV parked across the street. They high-fived in the darkness like teenagers at a school dance. "About damn time," Sergio said. "I had money on 3 months ago. You owe me $100. "He was worth the wait," Enzo replied. Inside, Clara pulled back just enough to look at Dante's face, the scar, the intensity, the gentleness that had surprised everyone who'd ever known him. "Micah has a sleepover," she said softly. "She won't be back until tomorrow morning." "I know," Dante said. "I made sure Sergio arranged it. I wanted tonight to be just us." He led her to the couch where they sat with the drawing between them, and he told her about the night his father was murdered, about the rage that had consumed him for 20 years, about how fear had driven every decision he'd made. And Clara told him about the night she'd cried in closets, about the hunger she'd hidden from Micah, about the moment in the warehouse when she'd realized she would die to protect a stranger because maybe dying to protect someone was the only way she'd ever felt like her life meant something. By midnight, the rain had stopped. By morning, the sky had cleared into the kind of Los Angeles blue that only comes after a storm, clean, new, full of possibility. When Micah came home, she found Dante making pancakes in Clara's kitchen, Marco sitting at the table with a drawing spread out in front of him. The moment Micah saw them together, her face transformed into pure joy. "Does this mean Uncle Dante lives here now?" she asked, not quite understanding the metaphysics of love but understanding the mathematics of family. Clara and Dante exchanged a glance. "Yes," Dante said. "If that's okay with you." Micah ran to him and hugged him so hard his eyes glistened with tears, the first tears any of his men had ever seen fall from his face. In that moment, after the rain, the sky cleared. And sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that courage is standing up even when you have nothing left, that love isn't about transactions or obligation, and that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the most unexpected light. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Leave a comment and tell us, what would you have done in Clara's position? We read every single one. We wish you good health and days filled with peace. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.